June 6, 1944, 0710 hours. The base of Pointe du Hoc, Normandy. The English Channel is grey and churning, and Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, standing in Landing Craft Assault 888, watches his men struggle against waves that seem determined to drown them before the Germans get the chance. They are 40 minutes late. 40 minutes behind schedule in an operation where timing means everything. The pre-dawn darkness that was supposed to hide their approach is gone, burned away by a sunrise that exposes 225 Rangers to every German defender on the 100-foot cliff above them. Through his binoculars, Rudder sees something that makes his stomach tighten. The cliff face, which aerial photographs showed as steep but climbable, has been transformed by weeks of Allied bombing. The rock isn't just steep anymore. It's actively collapsing. Tons of chalk and limestone, loosened by 500-pound bombs, hang at impossible angles. Entire sections of cliff have slumped forward, creating overhangs that make the ascent not just difficult, but potentially impossible. And at the top, barely visible through the smoke and dust, German soldiers are moving into position. They've had 40 minutes to prepare. 40 minutes to set up machine gun fields of fire. 40 minutes to stack grenades within easy reach. If you enjoyed my stories, please subscribe. Consider it your little Christmas gift to me. I'd really appreciate your support. Rudder lowers his binoculars and looks at the men around him. These aren't ordinary soldiers. They're volunteers, every single one. They volunteered for Ranger training, which meant volunteering for the hardest physical conditioning the U.S. Army could devise. They volunteered again for this specific mission when they learned it involved scaling cliffs under fire. Most of them are between 19 and 23 years old. Farm boys from Texas, factory workers from Detroit, college students who left their degrees unfinished. None of them have ever seen combat before this morning. And now they're about to attempt what German commanders have declared impossible. The Germans believe no military force on Earth would be foolish enough to assault Pointe du Hoc from the sea. The cliff is too high, the defenses too strong, the approach too exposed. But American military planners looked at the same problem and came to a different conclusion. 6 French-made 155mm howitzers sit somewhere on top of that cliff. Each gun has a range of 11 miles. Omaha Beach, where thousands of American soldiers are landing right now, is only 4 miles away. Those guns can turn Omaha into a slaughter pen, unless someone climbs that cliff and destroys them. The mathematics of the situation are simple and terrible. If those guns remain operational, thousands of Americans will die on Omaha Beach. If the Rangers fail to climb the cliff, the guns remain operational. Therefore, the Rangers cannot fail. Cannot. Even though the mission seems impossible. Even though they're 40 minutes late. Even though the Germans are waiting. The story of how these men ended up at the base of this cliff began 5 months earlier, in January of 1944, when Rudder was summoned to a briefing at 1st Army headquarters. A staff officer showed him aerial photographs of Pointe du Hoc. The promontory jutted into the English Channel like a knife blade, with Omaha Beach to the east and Utah Beach to the west. The 6 howitzers were clearly visible in the photographs, positioned in concrete emplacements that would protect them from all but direct hits from heavy bombers. Rudder studied the photographs for a long moment. Then he looked up at the officer and said, "You're kidding." The officer wasn't kidding. The Rangers would land at the base of the cliff in darkness, at exactly 0630 hours, designated H hour. They would scale the cliff using rope ladders and grappling hooks fired from rocket launchers. Once on top, they would neutralize the guns using thermite grenades, which would melt the firing mechanisms beyond repair. Then they would push south to the coastal highway, cut German communications, and establish roadblocks to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. The entire operation needed to be completed in 30 minutes. Rudder's Rangers trained for this mission with an intensity that bordered on obsession. On the cliffs of the Isle of Wight, they practiced with every rope configuration the British commandos could suggest. They experimented with extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, mounted on WWII amphibious trucks. They tested rocket-fired grappling hooks until they could place them within inches of their target. Every man learned to climb with full combat load, 70 pounds of weapons and ammunition, while exhausted and soaking wet. Because that's how they would arrive at Pointe du Hoc. Exhausted from the Channel crossing, soaking wet from the landing, and expected to perform superhuman feats immediately. The training revealed something crucial about these Rangers. They weren't supermen. They were ordinary Americans who had decided that impossible missions just required more preparation. Private First Class Harry Fate from Cleveland spent 2 weeks learning to climb a wet rope using only his legs, saving his arm strength for the top. Sergeant Leonard Lommel from New Jersey practiced throwing thermite grenades until he could hit a garbage can from 15 yards in total darkness. Technical Sergeant William Stuyvesant from Tennessee memorized every detail of the German bunker layout until he could navigate them blindfolded. But no amount of training prepared them for what actually happened on the morning of June 6th. The plan called for the Rangers to land at exactly 0630, in darkness with naval gunfire still suppressing the German defenders. Instead, a navigation error sent their landing craft 3 miles off course. By the time Lieutenant Mervyn Spiel spotted the mistake and corrected it, precious minutes had evaporated. The Rangers approached Pointe du Hoc not in pre-dawn darkness, but in full daylight. The naval gunfire had ceased, per schedule, 15 minutes earlier, and every German defender on the cliff had time to return to their positions and prepare a reception. The first landing craft hit the narrow beach at 0710 hours. The ramps dropped. Rangers poured out into chest-deep water and immediately began taking casualties. Machine gun fire from the cliff top raked the beach. German soldiers threw grenades down from positions the Rangers couldn't see. Some Rangers, weighed down by 70 pounds of equipment, stepped into underwater shell craters and drowned in 15 feet of water before their comrades could reach them. Those who made it to the base of the cliff found themselves in a nightmare landscape. Allied bombing had created artificial caves, sheltered positions, but it had also made the cliff actively hostile. The rock face was unstable. Handholds crumbled. Sections of cliff that looked solid were actually loose rubble held together by momentum. And the Germans above had excellent fields of fire on anyone attempting to climb. The Rangers began firing their rocket-launched grappling hooks. The rockets roared up the cliff face, trailing rope behind them. Some hooks caught on rubble at the top and held. Others bounced off and fell back. The ropes, soaked by seawater during the landing, were now 30% heavier than in training and stretched under their own weight. German defenders, when they could expose themselves long enough, leaned over the cliff edge and cut ropes with knives or pushed off grappling hooks with poles. It should have been impossible. Every military analysis said so. The Germans believed it. Even some Allied planners privately doubted it could work. But the Rangers began climbing anyway. Not because they were fearless. Many of them later admitted they were terrified. They climbed because the mission required it. Because thousands of Americans on Omaha Beach needed those guns destroyed. Because turning back wasn't an option anyone had mentioned during training. Sergeant Lommel, leading his section up a rope that swayed with every movement, found himself thinking about something his training instructor had said. You don't climb fast. You climb steady. Fast gets you killed. Steady gets you to the top. Lommel climbed steady, hand over hand, boots finding purchase on disintegrating limestone. German bullets snapping past close enough to feel the pressure wave. A grenade exploded 30 feet to his left, the concussion strong enough to swing his rope like a pendulum. He kept climbing. Below him, Technical Sergeant Bill Petty climbed with a 30-pound Bangalore torpedo strapped to his back. The explosive charge, designed to blow gaps in barbed wire, made him top-heavy and awkward. A German machine gun found his rope, tracers walking up the cliff face. Petty froze, pressed against the rock, and waited for the burst to pass. Then he resumed climbing. Steady. Not fast. Steady. The first Ranger to reach the top was First Sergeant Leonard Lommel. He pulled himself over the edge at 0741 hours, 31 minutes after landing. The ground he found himself on looked like the surface of the moon. Bomb craters overlapped bomb craters. Concrete bunkers, designed to withstand artillery, had been cracked open by 500-pound bombs. Trees that had stood for centuries were now splinters. The earth itself had been pulverized into gray dust that coated everything. But the most important discovery came in the first 60 seconds. The gun emplacements that were supposed to contain 6 155mm howitzers were empty. The massive concrete casemates had been built, were complete, 2 still under construction. But there were no guns inside. The Germans had removed them. For a fraction of a second, every ranger who reached the top felt the same crushing realization. They had climbed an impossible cliff under fire. They had lost men in the water, on the beach, on the cliff face. All to destroy guns that weren't there. The mission, the terrible, costly mission, had been based on outdated intelligence. But Rudder, pulling himself over the cliff edge, didn't pause to despair. "Find them," he ordered. "The guns are here somewhere. Find them and destroy them." Sergeant Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn volunteered to push inland. The rest of the Rangers, now numbering fewer than 90 men who had made the climb, began establishing defensive positions around the cliff top. They found German defenders in bunkers and fighting positions, killed or captured them, and turned the German fortifications against counterattacks they knew were coming. Lommel and Kuhn moved south through the lunar landscape of bomb craters. They crossed the coastal highway that was one of their objectives. And then, roughly 800 yards inland, hidden in a sunken farm lane camouflaged with hedgerows, they found what they were looking for. All 6 French 155mm howitzers, lined up in a perfect row, pointing toward Omaha Beach. The guns were fully operational. Ammunition was stacked nearby. The crews were somewhere else, probably responding to the invasion, but they had left their weapons ready to fire. Lommel and Kuhn approached carefully. No guards were visible, but that seemed too good to be true. Just one click to subscribe means a lot to me. Even as a small Christmas gift, your subscription truly helps. The 2 Rangers reached the first gun. Lommel pulled thermite grenades from his pack. The thermite burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel firing mechanisms into slag. He placed 2 grenades in the recoil mechanism of the first gun, pulled the pins, and moved to the second gun. The thermite ignited with a white flash that was painful to look at directly. Smoke rose in perfect vertical columns in the still morning air. Lommel destroyed the first 2 guns. His grenades were exhausted, but Kuhn had more. Together they destroyed the remaining 4 howitzers. The mission was complete. The guns that could have slaughtered thousands of Americans on Omaha Beach would never fire again. But completing the mission didn't mean surviving it. As Lommel and Kuhn ran back toward the Ranger perimeter, German forces were organizing their response. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, part of the 352nd Infantry Division, were moving toward Pointe du Hoc. These weren't rear echelon troops. They were combat veterans who had fought in Russia, and they understood immediately that the Americans on the cliff top represented a dagger pointed at the heart of German coastal defenses. The Germans began their first counterattack at approximately 1000 hours. 40 soldiers from the 1st Company of the 914th Grenadier Regiment advanced toward the Ranger positions from the south. They expected to find a handful of scattered Americans, disorganized by their assault, low on ammunition. Instead, they found Rangers who had transformed the German fortifications into a defensive perimeter. Machine guns positioned in bunkers. Mortars registered on likely approach routes. Fields of fire that overlapped. The German attack broke against Ranger firepower, but it was just the first. Throughout June 6th, the Germans launched attack after attack. The Rangers, now numbering fewer than 90 men capable of fighting, held a perimeter roughly 200 yards across. They were isolated. The reinforcements that were supposed to arrive within hours were stuck on Omaha Beach, fighting for their lives. Naval gunfire could provide support, but only if the Rangers could maintain radio contact, and German artillery was targeting their command post specifically. By nightfall on June 6th, Rudder's command post, a crater reinforced with timber and sandbags, looked like the most dangerous place in Normandy. And Rudder, wounded twice during the day, refused to leave it. The Rangers had accomplished their mission. They had destroyed the guns. They controlled the coastal highway, but they were paying a price that seemed to increase with every hour. That night, as German forces infiltrated through the bomb-cratered landscape, individual rangers found themselves cut off from the main perimeter. Some were captured. Others fought desperate close-quarters battles in darkness so complete they identified friend from foe by voice. The Germans launched a major counterattack around 2300 hours. Approximately 40 soldiers, moving under cover of darkness, attempted to overrun the ranger positions. They were stopped by rangers who had spent the entire day fighting, who were down to their last magazines, who were wounded and exhausted, but who refused to yield ground they had paid for with their brothers' blood. June 7th brought no relief. The Rangers expected reinforcements from Omaha Beach. They didn't arrive. German forces, recognizing the threat the Rangers represented, continued attacking. Not massive assaults, but constant pressure. Probing attacks that forced the Rangers to expend ammunition they couldn't replace. Sniper fire that made any movement deadly. Mortar barrages that fell with increasing accuracy as German forward observers identified Ranger positions. By the end of June 7th, Rudder had fewer than 70 men capable of fighting. And they were running out of everything that mattered. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, water. The third day, June 8th, began with the Rangers preparing for what they assumed would be their final stand. They had held for 48 hours. They had completed their mission. If this was where their war ended, they had done everything asked of them and more. But at approximately 0800 hours, Rangers on the perimeter heard a sound that seemed impossible. Tank engines. American tank engines. The 743rd Tank Battalion, supporting elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment and Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion, had finally fought their way from Omaha Beach. The relief column pushed through the last German positions and linked up with Rudder's defenders at 0900 hours on June 8, 1944. When the relief force arrived, they found a scene that seemed impossible to believe. The Rangers had transformed Pointe du Hoc into a fortress. Every approach was covered by fire. German weapons captured during the battle had been turned against their former owners. The perimeter showed signs of desperate fighting. Shell craters within shell craters. Abandoned German equipment. American casualties who had been fighting from positions even after being wounded. And in the center of this moonscape, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder emerged from his command post, wounded, exhausted, but still in command. His first words to the relief force were a question. "What took you so long?" Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at the base of the cliff on the morning of June 6th, fewer than 75 were still capable of bearing arms when relief arrived. 77 Rangers had been killed. 152 were wounded. 38 were listed as missing, most of them captured during the confused fighting on June 6th and 7th. The casualty rate exceeded 70%. For 2 days and 2 nights, vastly outnumbered, cut off from reinforcement, low on everything except courage, these Rangers had held Pointe du Hoc against a German force that should have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe even just as a Christmas gift. It may be a small thing, but it makes a big difference. The official after-action reports called Pointe du Hoc a tactical success. The guns were destroyed. The coastal highway was cut. The Rangers completed every objective assigned to them. But the Rangers themselves understood something the reports couldn't capture. They had done more than complete a mission. They had proved that impossible cliffs could be climbed, that overwhelming odds could be overcome, that a handful of determined men, properly trained and absolutely committed, could change the outcome of the largest amphibious invasion in history. German commanders, analyzing the battle afterward, kept returning to one question. How did they do it? The cliff was supposed to be unclimbable. The defenders were veterans. The Americans were outnumbered. By every tactical calculation, the assault should have failed. But it succeeded because 225 Rangers decided that success wasn't optional. Pointe du Hoc today is preserved as a battlefield memorial. The bomb craters remain. The German bunkers still stand. You can walk the ground these Rangers fought for and see the cliff they climbed. The monument at the top, a simple granite pylon, bears an inscription. These are the men who took the cliffs. It doesn't mention the impossibility of the mission. It doesn't detail the casualties. It simply states what happened. These men took the cliffs because the mission required it, because thousands of Americans on Omaha Beach needed those guns destroyed, because impossible isn't a reason to quit. It's just a description of how hard you'll have to work. The Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc went on to fight across France and into Germany. But they never forgot those 2 days in June when they held impossible ground against impossible odds. When they climbed a cliff that couldn't be climbed. When they destroyed guns that threatened an invasion. When they proved that courage and training and absolute commitment can overcome any obstacle. Even a 100-foot cliff held by veteran German defenders. Even when you're 40 minutes late. Even when the ropes are wet and the Germans are cutting them. Even when reinforcements don't arrive. Even when the mission seems impossible. These are the men who took the cliffs. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, even just as a Christmas gift. It may be a small thing, but it makes a big difference.